But to take God at his word,
all these triumphant, I am the warrior God who has conquered all things, and they all belong to me, not in the future, but now. Right?
I'm getting all excited here, man.
There you. I need a. Welcome back to Eschatology Matters. I'm Josh Howard, and I'm joined by Tim, the tech man Bushong. Tim, good to talk to you again, brother.
If only I were that technologically advanced. I seem impaired, to quote Weird Al, but yeah.
No,
good to see you, brother.
Absolutely. It's been too long. I was looking back at the videos, and we both looked much younger when we spoke last, so we need to do this more often.
Man, it's those 5 grandkids, I'm telling you. I don't know what's your excuse.
Young children, I don't know.
Yeah,
it's good we're talking eschatology, though, because we're talking about hope even as we age. So I want to just jump right in, Tim. There were so many topics, and this is one of the detriments of not speaking more often and following up on these more often. Is when we chatted last, we did a couple at one time. There were so many topics that were still on my mind, and I know we were wanting to talk through, but I wanted to jump into a couple today. But one of the first ones was essentially the question is, how useful or helpful is it to use terms and categories when we talk about eschatology? And I want to frame that question just a little bit. One of the things that we've oftentimes experienced in church life in general, you pastor, I pastor, we're involved in ministry in various circles and various formats. And a lot of times you'll run into various Christians who will say, well, I don't want to put a label on myself. I'm just a Bible believing Christian, or I'm just a Christian in general. Like, I don't want to say, and they could be talking about broad things like, denominational categories. Well, I don't want to say I'm a Baptist, I'm just a Christian. Or they could be talking about specific kind of hot button issues. Well, I'm not a Calvinist or an Arminian, I'm just a Christian. Anyway, and so before I play my hand and put all the cards on the table a little bit too much, walk us into that with eschatology, because I think that's one of the things that will inevitably surface within eschatology is, how helpful is it to say you're post-mill if you have to explain what kind of post-mill you are? How helpful is it to talk about dispensational thought when there's such a wide variance within that? Walk us into that a little bit, Tim.
Well, sure, and I think this is just basic communication, basic understanding where a man's coming from, because as Proverbs says, as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. And Richard Weaver, ideas have consequences. So when you're getting to know someone, let's just take for an example, you've got a young family and they've begun to attend the church. They love the reverent and joyful worship. They love the liturgy, the sermons they've already examined. And so you sit down with this couple and they've got kids jumping around in the background. You're distracted, but certain questions are going to come up, right? So how important is this to me joining your church? Because I'm not really sure I'm on the same page as you. Right. And as soon as you ask that question, you're going to have to define some terms. So that's just a real practical pastoral application. And I think within any group, I'm a part of the Southern Baptist Convention. Are we going to define that by saying Southern Baptist? My goodness, you've got every possible variation on soteriological commitments, eschatological commitments, even worship. I mean, I visited a church. I thought for sure it was going to be hymn books and an organ and piano. And they had the team up there, and it was this one long extended time of singing. It was a surprise for me. Right. And again, I'm not saying that was good, bad, or neutral, but it was not what I expected. And so if someone's going to come up and say, and have you seen the emo Phillips bit on this, where he meets the guy on the bridge, don't jump off, and it goes on and on and on. Oh, you're a Christian, me too, what kind? And it goes all the way down to the most excruciating minutia of doctrinal commitment or denominational affiliation. And he says, so are you a Southern Baptist, South Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina, or are you a Southern Baptist, Sandy Creek? He goes, I'm a Southern Baptist, Sandy Creek. And I said, die, heretic. And I pushed him off the bridge.
Nice and me too. Northern Conservative Fundamentalist Baptist, Great Lakes Region, Council of 1879. Northern Conservative Fundamentalist Baptist, Great Lakes Region, Council of 1912. He says, Northern Conservative Fundamentalist Baptist, Great Lakes Region, Council of 1912. I said, die, heretic.
It's great. Look, everyone look up that thing. It's still on YouTube. But of course, that is the most extreme and hyperbolic way of thinking about this.
For sure. Yeah.
But I think it's perfectly legitimate to find out where someone stands. Again, put yourself in the shoes of this young family. You want to know what kind of group you're getting into.
Right.
So far, so good. Everyone loves us. They love our children. I've been edified by the content of the sermons. And then you get to the point where you join the church and it's, yes, you must affirm a pre-millennial, pre-wrath rapture. And all of a sudden you're like, well, I don't even know what that is.
And that's one of the things, Tim, like, so, doctrinal clarity matters, right? Like no matter what the church, you can have, for example, Southern Baptist on your church sign, or you can not have it on your church sign, but like doctrinal clarity, if I walk in your doors, we should be able to say like where you stand. It seems there's two thoughts that have come to me kind of in pastoral ministry, but I think this impacts eschatology, and that's where we're moving to. But number one, it seems that when we don't use those labels, we oftentimes lose our doctrinal distinctives. So if we avoid all labels and we avoid all doctrinal precision, if we aim for the wash, we will find ourselves in the wash, right? And that's where you wander into these churches that you can have two pastors serving in the same church and they don't agree on hardly anything other than the fact that there's a man that was named Jesus Christ. And that's troubling on the one hand. On the second hand, though, it's just unavoidable that you have to use categories to describe yourself. Because like you just said, unless I'm going to sit down with you and say, okay, let's walk through the Nicene Creed, and then I'm going to walk through the Chalcedonian definition, and then we're going to walk through this list of, okay, if you want to take 2 hours every time you encounter a new Christian, but it's a lot easier for me to just say, hey, here's where I stand, and let me define anything that's not clear. That's just kind of unavoidable.
Absolutely. It's like someone saying years ago, a friend of mine, who's really sharp, but he had these Anabaptist tendencies. And he said, oh, Tim, come on. We both know that denominationalism and creeds and confessions are God's judgment on the church. And of course, my immediate response, being the soul of tact that I am, I said, are you willing to put that down in writing? Because what he just did was what he accuses everyone else of doing. There's just a lack of self-reflection. And the context was, it was a local church and who we're going to affiliate with. And I said, listen, I love you as a brother. We don't agree here. I've got all these other people to think of, and we're on the same page regarding doctrine A, B, and C. It wouldn't work for us to come in under your wing as either a sending church or a, Mother Kirk at that point. It just wouldn't work.
Right.
We're not on the same page. And I know that because every one of these people are confessional. In this sense. So for us, it was 1689, one or two Westminster folks, but we know where that differentiation really is. So yeah, I think it's unavoidable. It's kind of like this revival that's taking place down in Asbury Seminary.
Oh, you're going to go right in there, Tim.
It's current. I'm sticking my big toe in the water, my little toe staying out. The point I'm making with referencing that is that from the footage I've seen, it does appear to me to be a kind of extended. Somebody on my Facebook page said, I hope it's not just an extended afterglow service. I'm like, that's kind of what I see. My point was, if this is a move of the Spirit, now let's define the Holy Spirit, the third person of the Trinity, proceeds from the Father and the Son, who with the Father and the Son together is glorified. If it's him, then the effects of that revival, if it's true revival, it's going to change some things that they do down at Asbury.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It can't help but do that. Doug Wilson famously said, our theology should come out of our fingertips. That's just one more way of saying that obedience to Christ across the board all the things that you and I have been talking about for the last 2 or 3 months, the exhaustive right that our king has to determine the boundaries of men's behavior.
And that really, Tim, I didn't mean to walk on top of you, but that to me is where eschatology comes into it. So when we talk about eschatological,
you keep trying to go there.
I'm trying to keep us back on this. No,
That's
but with those eschatological categories, honestly, like right in line with what you were just talking about, the eschatology impacts the way you live. And that's why, to me, eschatology is not just something, and I know to you too, as well, this is not just something to get together and argue about Revelation 20. I mean, we can do that too, but there's so much more. And that's one of the reasons why I would make the petition for maintaining some eschatological categories. And I'm going to give an example, and then I want to hand it right back to you on this one, Tim. But when we think about those eschatological categories, so if you talk about postmillennialism right now, like let's just pick on postmillennialism, you have a pretty wide range within postmillennialism that you could find. You have some that are in the full preterism camp. We've talked a lot about that recently. You have some that'll talk about theonomy, and then they'll subdivide that into maybe general equity theonomy, et cetera, et cetera. And so you look at all these different defining characteristics and you say, oh, well, then there's no real point in using the term. I'm not convinced of that yet, because if you were to talk about postmillennialism, I can make certain assumptions about the way your theology is impacting the way you live. And typically we're talking about far more, as we've talked about, plenty on this channel, but it impacts so much more than your view of Revelation 20. This is impacting your hermeneutic of how you read scripture. This is impacting the way you view the covenants. This is impacting so many things in scripture. So to me, that fits right in with that. Like, why would you make an appeal to preserve any sort of camps or any sort of, just camps and groupings within eschatology? It would be because
categories, labels.
Right. Yeah. Because it informs how then you're allowing that eschatology to form your life and practice, which is the whole point we're getting at.
Yeah. So take what you just said, why you would want to do that. I remember calling a man in Hawaii. I was trying to ascertain, what their group was about. And by the end of it, he's like, well, you're just trying to put me in a box. And I said, no, I'm just trying to find out where you stand, because what you believe about those things is going to impact how you minister in this area as well.
Right.
So, and here's the other thing, we want to be careful. And I believe it was Brian Mattson that I don't know if he coined the term, but we want to be magnanimous in our rhetoric. In other words, because you've arrived here, we don't assume that they absolutely have to arrived at the same place. Maybe they're not connecting the dots yet, right?
Right. Or at least not at the same time necessarily. Yeah.
And in the same way, right? Yeah. So the other part then is what you said about some categories. At least they believe such and such. So example, let's go to post-millennialism, right? Some people see that and a cold hand reaches up and clutches them by the liver, and they see all of these associations that ain't necessarily so.
Right.
I remember when I was teaching on it it'll be 2 years this summer, and I said that structurally postmillennialism is similar to amillennialism, because we believe that right now is that 1,000 years in which was mentioned by John in Revelation 20. Right. Well, a couple of the guys got up and they're like, oh, I see, you are a non-millennialist. Well, because in their mind, you had to have that, I believe it's probably from Edwards and Puritans and 19th century guys, where it continues to grow, the kingdom expands, and then there's 1,000 years of a golden age.
Right.
An exact number. Nothing wrong with holding that. Not a problem. But the most recent crop, and I'm going back 70, 80 years, of postmillennialists don't necessarily teach that. They're with the Amil guys. So then when you say postmillennialist to an Amil guy, he should recognize, okay, even if that's true, even if that's the case, the difference between me and that post-mill guy is that he expects a Christianization. And so I'm gonna maybe watch him become a little more active in cultural and political endeavors than I would,
right? Because
I don't see that as being necessarily part of God's kingdom expansion. Does that make sense?
Let's jump right in. Yes, it makes sense. But I want to jump in right on that because I feel like that leads into one of the things I wanted to talk to you about. So when we talk about, and again, this is recognizing there's a broad swath within, any of these views. And so you can find different things. Again, that should, when we hear that shouldn't discourage us to use terms, but it should make us wary of constructing straw men, right?
Let me jump in just for a second.
Sure.
And hold that thought because we're going to go there. I had just listened to a 50-minute lecture by Greg Bonson delivered in his Sunday school class in 1992.
What a Sunday school, man.
Oh, yeah. He said at the outset, this isn't your normal Sunday school lesson. It was a history of Reconstructionism.
Wow.
And so he's one of the players, and he's going back to the late 60s and walking us through. By the time he gets to minute 52, can I have another 3 minutes? And the guy says, of course, you're Greg Bonson. He tells us all the things that these they would call themselves by that label. So that's we're talking a subset of a subset of a subset, all the things they disagreed about. Just name it. TV, head coverings.
Wow. Yeah.
Public education, homeschooling,
right.
Sports. The list went on and on and on where they weren't exactly on the same page. But when we see Reconstructionist, we automatically think at least of one thing, and that is rebuilding a society based on God's law.
Right.
So, of course, a cynic would say, well, the devil's in the details. Well, sure, and those things need to be hammered out, and we need to have grace for the other person.
Right.
But at the same time, it's like at least we're on that road heading somewhere.
Right. And the issues are being laid out.
Yeah. So anyway, I just wanted to bring that up about, the label and the incredible amount of diversity that there was. It even caused them to split and have some personal rancor
right
in their ranks. And it seemed avoidable to me, but right. I've got a couple people that don't like me too. So
no, that's good. Honestly, Tim, my main takeaway from everything you just said was just we need to have Greg Bonson lecture for 50 minutes in our Sunday schools. That might change some things, I would think, in our churches. But let me ask you this, because this is kind of the point I wanted to kind of segue into just a little bit, just for a minute, is when we're thinking about those type of things. Now, you mentioned, and I think this is a fair, broad brushstrokes general truth, is that most postmillennials will see more social engagement and more Christianization of society, nation, etc. And more Amills will see maybe more of a distinction there. Maybe less of an involvement in society and less of a Christianization and more of a focus on the church life and the church sphere. And we're going to talk about a lot of those things. We've got a chat with Joe Booth that's coming up, among others, and we'll talk through some of those issues. But when you're thinking about this, I'm looking for book recommendations, and I know that's subjective, but that's okay because we're the two that are talking. But you stole, for example, Anthony Holcomb from me. I saw in one of your recent run-throughs, which I just love Anthony Holcomb's work, and I would heartily recommend him. But if we're thinking specifically, because you and I talk Schaeffer, but some people may not be familiar with Schaeffer, walk us through a couple of those figures that could at least give you insight into how the Christian church, and again, everybody's subjective, so this is from their viewpoints, but how we are to engage culture and what that looks like to avoid those straw men that people might hear, that when you say we're to Christianize the world or disciple the nations, they hear in their head, oh, he wants to execute Muslims in the streets. And no, we're not talking about that. What are we talking about, though? Walk us into that.
Yeah, well, the meme version would be it's either some sort of theonomy or drag queen story hour. I mean, that's the most, I guess, hyperbolic way of saying it.
Right.
So for me, coming up through church in the 60s and 70s and having that kind of pietistic dispensationalist, that was the worldview there. And that affected our view of God's law as well. And you would read Galatians and say, well, I've got it all figured out. And then hear some guy like a Bonson come in and say, yeah, but the application of God's law in society, there's no option to that because natural law only goes so far. It can't teach these things. And you're back with justification and soteriology. Thinking, right. No, wait, that doesn't compute. Well, it's because we're not allowing all of Scripture to speak to the topic. We're not talking about soteriology. So when Schaeffer famously talked about linking arms with non-Christians to be co-belligerents in cultural endeavors. A lot of people saw that and saw, well, that's compromise. You know, a lot of people would look at that and say, no, 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 come out from among them, be separate.
Right.
But his point was, we're not in the sphere of evangelism. We're in the sphere of drag queen story hour. You know, this is coming in as a, hey, you need to get on board with this or you're the bad guy. And the church has a prophetic voice for that, right? So from what I understand, and I tell people this now, I say, well, I kind of cut my teeth on, you know, the God who is there, escape from reason, and he is there, not silent. Their eyes just glaze over and say, well, that's because you're one of those wonky guys, Tim, or whatever. And I'm like, no, Schaeffer's Kuyper for dummies. Schaeffer is a lot of Rushdoony's work was distilled in Schaeffer. That's one of those personal allegiance things when people say, well, he just ripped off Rushdoony. And I have to say, well, whether it was borrowing or ripping off, or dare I say some plagiarism, it wasn't word for word, whatever it was. It all came through those lectures at L'Abri that he was giving to all the crazy existentialists coming from the Sorbonne and other universities in Europe, because they had just become unmoored from any real anchoring to reality.
Right. Don't leave out a Christian manifesto now either, Tim.
Yeah. Don't forget that, or the great evangelical disaster, or how should we then live, or on and on and on.
Very good.
Hopefully we all have that multicolored Crossway collection of books in our library.
Right.
It's great for reference. And to be honest, a guy like Schaeffer or Rushdoony or Kuyper, you can take what they said and exchange some current events for the things that they might have been talking about.
Right.
And it still adds up. Solzhenitsyn, same thing. What was his main point? Statism. They're going to control, come in. It'll be from within, not from without. It's either Christ or that, you know.
Right.
So what you're saying about how this then impacts your normal life, daily life, pastoral ministry, all of these things together. If someone says that I'm too politically involved, let's say, I'm like, all right, so on one level, I think it's important that the civil magistrate obey Jesus. That's his job. That's Romans 13. And I don't believe that he can get there without reference to God's law. Again, yes, people know who God is from creation. People have the natural general revelation, even common grace. But at the same time, how do you know for sure, infallibly, that this area over here is actually murder or theft? Because you've got categories that the Bible's given us. Right. Sorry. So with that, they would say, okay, you're too politically motivated. So, no, I'm not propping up a candidate, a party. I'm not pushing for a specific agenda unless it has to do with clearly delineated biblical categories such as human life.
Right.
I think frankly, and this may be a little too broad brush, but I think people are really uncomfortable with the intersection between church and state because they believe a bill of goods that has been sold to them. And that is that the separation of church and state means that the church has no voice in the machinations of state, or in speaking to the civil magistrate, or in even, dare I say, providing the grid from which that civil magistrate can govern.
Right.
It's scary.
And Tim, that honestly, we're going to get derailed and go an hour on this, because this is the conversation though that's upcoming, and I'm glad you're bringing it up. But I would say I agree with you in the fact that this shouldn't be scary for the Christian, precisely because God defines these authorities. And this is, we're thinking of like who to suggest to people. We've recommended Abraham Kuyper before. Kuyper's not exactly the easiest to read, but there's others that came after him that kind of interpret.
Like Schaeffer.
Yeah, like Schaeffer, right?
Yeah.
So Kuyper light.
Yeah.
But just the idea of different spheres of sovereignty that God has instituted in this world. And I think for most Christians, we live with those those categories, whether we've examined them or not. And that's the whole push here, is to examine why is murder wrong? Why, if you were in our country and somebody murders somebody, and again, I know we're derailing a bit, but I think this is important. If somebody murders somebody, I'm going to say it's wrong, not because the law says it's wrong. The law is right precisely because God says it's right. God says murder is wrong, therefore that law is a good and just law. Now, if you rewound it to 1939 and in Nazi-controlled Germany, some murder wasn't wrong. Now, according to the law. Now, we look back with our biblical lenses and we say, no, that's still murder, and we held them accountable at Nuremberg. And yet, in that society, it was lawful. So why is there an eternal law? I think what people get uncomfortable with is when we try to apply that same biblical reasoning to things like what happened 3 years ago. At what point does the government step outside of its sphere of authority in instructing the church? We would be comfortable at the point of, there's Nazi stormtroopers on our doorstep and they demand you to deny Christ, but that's not where the rub usually comes in. It's with all the other things.
It doesn't start there.
Right. So anyway, we could go down that road, but I think what you're introducing people into, though, this is historic Christian thought. This is not new. This is historic Christian thought, and it's appealing to biblical categories that are vital for us to walk through, I think.
Right. So to what you just said, you're right. It doesn't begin with the knock on the door at midnight and the KGB took the Smyrnses away, but at least the trains run on time. What was going on in Germany in the late 30s? Years ago, we had a conference in my old church called "Render unto Caesar?" ? And the topic of my talk was 3 different historical examples of the church interacting with society. One was the Roman Empire, the other one was Calvin's Geneva, and then the third was Hitler's Germany. And how the official state church, the Lutherans, they appealed to this really radical spirituality of the church motif, and that even allowed some of their own members to get on board with the anti-Semitism and this would be better for society in the long run. It was just a total mess. And you're right, Nuremberg. What was the appeal? The appeal was to a higher power.
Absolutely.
Well, he remained as yet undefined,
right?
But in that culture in Western Europe, what are we talking about?
Oh yeah,
we're talking about the God of the Bible.
There is a standard, right? There is an unavoidable standard to which we're appealing. There's no neutrality in that regard.
That's right. And I think one of the things that me and my postmillennialist brothers refuse to do is to allow some kind of established demilitarized zone, some neutral category, some naked public square, where there's a certain segment of the populace that's not obligated to keep God's law in these very critical areas.
Right.
That may sound harsh to some, but I'm thinking, okay, let's take the number 2 issue in our country today. Number 1 is the Rainbow Coalition and your acceptance of that. I only put that because it's more headlining. However, Roe versus Wade was overturned last year. Think about some of our responses to the overturning of Roe. The whole time, any state governor could have at any moment said, not in my backyard, signed it into law, depending on the majority. But they were terrified too. They don't want happening at their doorsteps what took place after the Civil Rights Act and in the South.
Sure. Yeah.
Which, by the way, there's a whole nother spirituality of the church area right there. We could go back to the American Civil War and see how that doctrine allowed certain sections of the South, even if they weren't slave owners,
right,
to say, well, this is not our area, it's not our wheelhouse,
right,
whatever. We won't go there.
No,
I just did, but we don't have to. So let's go to our current situation. Last summer, when Roe was overturned, we had put together a letter that would be very appropriate for anyone to sign, including clergy, including pastors, an appeal to the magistrate who's in charge of this stuff, right, i.e. the governor of the state. Would you please do the right thing? We're appealing to you on this level that God says this is murder. You know it's murder. Science says it's murder. We even
Right.
went to, natural law there. Sign into law the complete and utter end of abortion in the state. And there's always the accepted life of the mother, because that really happens. It's very rare. Usually an emergency C-section will take care of that. And I got one guy, in fact, who lives right over here, my neighbor. God bless him. He sent it out to every representative, circled it among the church. Good for him. I didn't expect that, to be honest. Nobody else. Our thoughts and prayers are with you.
Tim, that's where I think that's where the rubber meets the road, though, for the church. Because in that regard, and you and I have talked about this, you had a co-belligerent in our church. So our church, we're in Michigan. We wrote a letter to our governor and made it public because it's a public address to a public official. We felt that was proper. And in that, we not only pled with our governor to not allow the murder of the unborn in our state, but we also appealed to God's law as our reasoning for that. It's not because we think babies are cute, nor because we think abortion's icky, although we do think both of those things. I think babies are adorable, and I think abortion's grotesque. But what we appealed to was what's in Scripture, that God formed them together in the womb, and that every one of them is made in His image, and that to kill them is to murder an unborn child. And so, really, that's what we're talking about: is at what point do we appeal to God's law, regardless of whether the state recognizes that law or not? And one of the things that we appealed to was Nahum, and it just happened to be because we were in the book of Nahum at that time in our sermon series. But Nahum crying out against a pagan king and a pagan culture, and he didn't appeal to, hey, don't kill people and flay them on your city wall because it's icky, although it is. He said, no, God has a law, and He will judge you whether you recognize Him or not for that law. And to me, that's where it hits the road for churches, and we need to be thinking through these issues, because I suspect we're going to be given ample opportunity to think through more issues as the years progress, if God tarries, and if this is not reversed in some form or fashion.
That's good, because upon what other standard would we appeal to our own governors?
Absolutely.
What are we going to do? Say, well, finally, now you're allowed to do this because the Supreme Court said such and such.
Right.
When the whole time that wouldn't even be true.
Right.
That was never law. It was one case.
Right.
And everyone said, well, we got to do what they say. Isn't it interesting now with other laws, the state of California is saying, nah, we're not going to do it. Just as if, oh, no big deal. We're just not going to do what y'all do. Right.
Right.
Oh,
well, let me transition us just slightly, Tim, because again, we could talk for 2.5 hours on that one, and we might need to. Maybe this will be one of those things we revisit in the coming weeks. But let me put this one little plug in as we're kind of transitioning slightly. If you're listening to this and you have thoughts or interaction, please reach out to us. We will make the links and email addresses available on this, but this is something that I think the Christian church needs to engage with. Tim and I aren't speaking out of some sort of hyperbolic or vitriolic stance. This isn't to prove a point. This is literally to contend with how must we live, to steal again Francis Schaeffer's phrase. But please reach out, let us interact with you, and know that as we interact with you, we're going to do so from a loving and biblical standpoint. And I hope that the interactions that are aimed at us are in that same vein. But let me direct us, Tim, to something we were talking about earlier, because I feel that what often happens, or it's not what I feel, I'm convinced what often happens is that we attach such an emotional weight, all of us, to certain figures that have propagated certain beliefs, that it becomes a matter of personal allegiance rather than necessarily doctrinal conviction. And what I mean by that is, we're talking specifically, we were just talking about state-sanctioned murder, essentially, is what we were just discussing. And one of the figures throughout history that dealt with that in a really interesting, fascinating case is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So during World War II, Nazi Germany, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was somebody, God used his book, The Cost of Discipleship, in my life in just an immense way. I named one of my sons after him. Bonhoeffer, that is. Yeah, but he can thank me later for that good German name. But I've tried to read everything that Bonhoeffer's written, and one of the things in every biography I can get my hands on concerning him. But as you look at Bonhoeffer's life, there was a change as his theology, which initially was a very naive, I think he would agree, a very naive, sheltered theology. He grew up in a very affluent family and very sheltered circles. And then all of a sudden he's confronting out of a very admirable, he didn't flee the battle. He's in the middle of a battle with Nazi Germany, taking over not just the country, but the church, which I think is inevitable. But you look at that and you see, how did he deal with those things? So number one, I put that out there as a plug for, if we're thinking through these things, you could do worse than read Boenhoffer, especially some of his latter work. Letters and Papers from Prison would be formative in that regard, and see how he confronted some of those things. But Boenhoffer was wrong on some things. Boenhoffer did not have it all right. If somebody came to me and said, hey, Boenhoffer seems to have been influenced by Karl Barth, or there seems to be shades of neo-orthodoxy in his writing, or there is, any number of issues you might bring up with Boenhoffer, it would be difficult for me, or hopefully not difficult, but it would at least be a temptation for me to take that as a personal attack on someone I feel personally vested in. I feel that in eschatology especially, so often that becomes the case. And that's not to dismiss others, but that's to recognize that we have to be careful with attaching an emotional attachment to a leader head within a doctrinal system, as opposed to an open-handed dealing with the issues. Have you experienced that, Tim, within your circles, or maybe even within your own life?
Yeah, absolutely. Years ago, I think I mentioned this, but a friendship cooled with a person that I should have been closer with for maybe 6 months, because he came out and said something I didn't appreciate about a national figure that I'd learned a lot from. And I'm like, well, okay, if I had that to do over, I probably wouldn't have reacted like that. I probably would have brushed it off a little more graciously than I did. In our circles, there definitely are he who shall not be named. And then other people are like, no, I've benefited greatly from a whole bunch of his stuff.
Right.
That doesn't mean that we necessarily agree with everything. If somebody brings up, for example, I counted Greg Strawbridge. I mentioned him earlier, Greg Straw, as a friend. I was not on the same page with him when it came to the nature of the new covenant. However, that doesn't mean that I'm going to sit here and listen to somebody attack Greg Strawbridge on the doctrine of justification by faith alone because I know he knew better.
Right.
And it is like, okay, we can pick our battles, but really, at the end of the day, we have to go back to the theonomy, God revealed scripture. We have to go back to how they handled that. I mean, I'm a Southern Baptist. You want to get in trouble? Say anything about Adrian Rogers.
Oh, you're not kidding. I'm from Memphis.
You're done. Yeah. And in our circles, there are a couple names that will definitely be like lightning rods for the kind of hey them's fighting words kind of stuff.
Right.
However, you have to take what they wrote in context, read it through, and say, what were they saying? And at the end of the day, that's why I can read Anthony Holcomb and appreciate so much of what he writes.
For sure.
When it comes to his couple different things, I'm like, nah, I don't get it. I don't get it. If someone who has been influenced quite a bit by a certain framework and they talk disparagingly about transforming culture or reconstructing culture, I'm not going to jump down their throat, even though the guys that I like are all for the transformation of culture. I pray for the day when people can walk down the middle of the street in Brooklyn or Queens and not be afraid at 1:30 in the morning. Let's just add that to it. Certain parts of Chicago you can't go to. Why? Because the gospel has not taken root and flourished in those areas. If it had, it's again back to Asbury. If this is gospel, then you're going to see effects of this that go on for generations and generations.
Right.
So we shouldn't get too tangled up about, celebrities or people that are authorities on the topic,
right?
Or even categories. As long as we're still thinking in terms of, okay, this is Jesus. He's the King. He has spoken, and we have His word. Is there anyone who's neutral about this?
Right.
No, not according to Paul.
Right.
Either, and Jesus himself, for or against, it's binary.
Yeah,
So
this seems to be, and the reason I brought it up was this seems to be within eschatology. If this is a risk for Christians in general or people in general, and eschatology seems particularly prone to this, is that it is not only attachment just to figures, which we do have that, but also attachment to categories. So we live in the day of cancel culture. We live in the day of writing somebody off at a moment's notice. Most of the time when I speak to somebody, and I'm thinking person in the pew primarily here, this is more of a pastoral take, but if I speak to somebody who has an eschatological take and I say, why do you believe that thing? Typically, they're going to start talking about a pastor who preached a sermon series. Now, that doesn't mean he was wrong or that it wasn't good, right? You and I both preach sermons, and I hope people are God changes hearts through his word. And yet at the same time, that shouldn't be your basis that man had a viewpoint. So therefore, but we also do it with categories. Some people are so committed to fill in the blank eschatological category that is their hill to die on. That's the point at which fellowship breaks, etc.
Right. I might have mentioned this in private, or I can't remember. We've done some of these now, and I've done some of my own talks. I'm like, hope I'm not repeating myself.
We just talk too much, Tim. That's the problem. Yeah.
That's it. And too much running around up here, useless information. But you take, for example, someone who comes to the position that Matthew 24, at least the first 2/3, was fulfilled in the destruction of Jerusalem.
Right.
Everything gets through those lenses now. Everything. They're partial predators. So all of that, Matthew 21, 22, 23, it's all about that. When really it's not all about that.
Right.
Jesus has some awesome, incredible things to say about stewardship that if you're off on that tangent, you're not going to see it, because, hey, he's talking to the Jews. They're going to reject him and they're going to be destroyed in AD 70. So therefore, and it gets unbalanced. The brood of truth has two wings, so it flies straight,
Right. No, that's good admonition to bring up on that. We've got a couple of other topics, but I'm not sure we're going to get to them today. I want to throw in one last one. Do you have time, Tim, for one last topic?
I have time, Tim.
All right. Man, is my drawl coming out? You must have seen my post. My drawl.
Man, tell you what, shooting out, dude, gang on, dude.
Yeah, Tim, it's hard to escape the South. You can run from the South, but the South don't run from you.
Man, when I get down there, I fit in.
Yeah, and you eat well. You have to hand it to. Whoa.
Yeah.
Prop the foot up. Let me ask you this, Tim. Because we threw out the word heresy in the past couple of weeks, and that's a word that oftentimes it's almost as if we've warned people against using the word heresy, because oftentimes that's just sort of a cudgel that we run to far too quickly. That's kind of like taking a sledgehammer to your foot when it's got a small cut on it instead of a band-aid. So like, we don't want to use that word disparagingly or certainly without thought, but at the same time there is place for that word within eschatology. And I think just pointing that out means eschatology is not a tertiary issue. At least all of eschatology is certainly not a tertiary issue, because heresies are not things that are of tertiary importance. We're talking about prime matters of importance. Can you just give us just a little bit of your insight into just the use of the word heresy? Hopefully we weren't wrong to use that word, and we use it with a lot of prayer and with a lot of trepidation in using such a word, because we're talking, when we say heresy, about something that will lead someone to destruction, something that leads away from God and into destruction, not just something that may be slightly off. How does heresy and the use of that word interact with eschatology in your mind, just as kind of a broad take on that?
Yeah, so circling back to the discussion about using labels in the first place, I think there are errors, there are heresies, and there are damnable heresies.
Okay.
And of course, that third category is the one that if you hold that, you are not a part of the people of God. You cannot be. Now, there may be a thin line between the second, the middle category of heresy, and to be honest, in eschatological terms, the one heresy I think that is pretty clear from the Bible and from our confessional heritage is he shall come again with glory to judge the quick and the dead. And you guys
Right.
have discussed that already. I don't, it's easy for people to attach that to systems that they themselves, they've worked through in their minds. And there's nothing more dangerous than an ex
Right.
charismatics on the soapbox. It's just so that you want to be careful there, and again, be balanced. But just because someone has not reached the same conclusions that you did doesn't mean that they're embracing heresy. That happened with the eternal subordination question a few years back. I mean, the H word was used among guys who, the year before were on the same dais.
I think that's still happening, but yeah.
Is
Yeah.
still happening? Well,
yeah, that one didn't die down.
I'll let them fight it. It's not something that I'm really having to
Right.
deal with. Probably gonna, it's gonna come up. It always does.
Right.
So one of the other things is that heresies aren't just reduced to doctrines that affect the Trinity either. Great example that where it is my local ministerial association not only allows for, but allowed a United Pentecostal Oneness Trinity denying heretic to rewrite their bylaws so that they could be part of the group.
Oh my.
Now listen, I cannot be a part of that.
Right.
They always tell me, but Brother Tim, we just want the community to see how we work together. I'm like, we're not working together.
Right.
I can't work with those people. They don't have the gospel. And the local Roman Catholics, they don't want anything to do with them anyway. So I didn't have to go there. But that's a genuine heresy, denying that the Son pre-existed as a divine person prior to the incarnation. You can't go to heaven and believe that. Can you go to heaven believing that God still has a plan for his old covenant people that's not necessarily the church?
Right.
Boy. And again, there are many variations of that too.
For sure.
I wouldn't use the H word there. I would just say, I think that's an error. I think it leads to a lot of conclusions and even life actions.
Right.
I knew a fellow moved his entire family to Israel to participate in the archaeological dig for the ashes of the red heifer. Now, that's pretty radical.
Right.
Because of those pre-commitments.
Right.
But that's rare.
And I think you're on the right track of there's been a lot of discussions, especially with the modern ressourcement movement or however you want to term those different movements, but an increased attention and appreciation for those doctrinal guardrails of the Christian church, such as the creeds and confessions. And I think there's a lot of healthy ways that's being done. But you brought up the confession. So if you were to think through, like, okay, even if you're not looking like for an opportunity to just run out and use the word heretic, but you are weighing in your mind, what are these matters that are of primary importance, where we're talking about definitional matters for Christianity. You could do worse than to look to some of those historic creeds, like you brought up from he will come again in glory to judge you used the old terminology, the quick and the dead, and his kingdom will have no end.
It's our Western heritage, the quick and the dead.
Hey man, I'm fine with that. I like it. So he'll come again, glory to judge the living and the dead, or the quick and the dead. You say he's not coming again in glory to judge the living and the dead, or you say he's already come in glory to judge the living and the dead. We have a primary issue, and that's where you're tiptoeing in heresy territory, I think. When you're on those primary matters of importance. I think for a lot of Christians, we've gotten used to a radical subjectivity when it comes to approaching doctrine. The primary things are what I deem them to be. The primary things are the things that I'm the most passionate about. And that's an imbalanced way of approaching eschatology and theology in general.
That's kind of you're exactly right. That's that version of the fundamentalism where that theological square just gets smaller and smaller, and you're on one foot balancing, and everything, there's nothing tertiary.
Right.
Everything's important. Everything's
primary.
Right. Life or death. Yeah.
Yep.
And we've all seen those guys, and it's like, okay, you can have your little cabal over there, fine, but the rest of it, we got work to do, man.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the reasons. And I do want to respect your time, Tim. So we'll probably wrap this one up for today. But that's one of the things I know we want to encourage with eschatology is number one, recognizing the fact that just because something's not of primary importance, and I mean first order importance, right? Something is not definitional between Christianity and heresy. It can still be important. Like it's still important what you think about Revelation chapter 20. It's still important what you think about the mark of the beast. These things are important, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to break fellowship with another Christian. I think that's really important for us as Christians to walk through. Eschatology can help us not only parse some of those areas of doctrinal triage or doctrinal differentiation, but they can also give us an increasing appreciation for the wide stretch and impact of those areas of primary importance, which we see again in eschatology so frequently.
Yeah. Sometimes people would see that triage as just, well, you guys are just trying to be pragmatic, and it's like, no. In fact, there are good examples. Jesus spoke of weightier matters of the law.
Right.
Yeah, it's important that you tithe 1/10 of your mint and cumin.
Right.
Do it.
Right.
But not to the exclusion of those really important things, justice and mercy.
Absolutely.
So there's always room for that. You were talking about confessionalism. Actually, the distillation of the 1689 has more to say about the return of Christ than does the 1689, the New Hampshire Confession of Faith. I was just looking at that the other day. So a church member that signs that has more detail on the return of Christ than the teaching officers at our church. Isn't that ironic?
Wow.
That's silly.
Wow.
That's silly.
No. Tim, we'll wrap it up for today. There's a couple of things I want to follow up on our next chat, but if you've got questions on what Tim and I have discussed, shoot us an email, interact with us online. And Tim, thanks for joining me again, brother. It's been a pleasure, man.
Man, a lot of fun. Thank you, Josh. Blessings on you and your church up there in Battle Creek,
Michigan, Cereal City.
Man, that's have you looked into that great history of the graham cracker?
So we'll visit that one next time, because there's lots of history.
It's related, isn't it?
It is very related.
I think you've been eating too much red meat.
All right. Talk to you soon, Tim. Appreciate you, man.
Okay. Bye, Josh.